This lecture will introduce myths of fertility, especially as they relate to Demeter and Dionysus, the male and female counterparts to fertility in the world as the Greeks saw it. So Demeter, we'll begin with her and Eleusinian Mysteries, this cult which promised a type of immortality if following its magical rites and rituals. Now, if you remember, the Greeks divided the female functions of the world, splitting Gaia's responsibilities into the main Olympians. Demeter is responsible for crops and, of course, agriculture. Hestia is the life of the house, the hearth and home. Hera oversees marriage. Aphrodite, sexual attraction, which of course ensures that new generations will be created. Artemis is going to be responsible for the fertility of wild game, animals, and Athena is responsible for teaching women craft and weaving. Demeter, or Ceres, arguably her name meaning mother, is the goddess of fertility and is related to the seasons. Her name gives us cereal, and she's often shown with a crown of wheat. The daughter of Zeus and Demeter is Persephone. Simply, she is called Kore, daughter or girl. She is one of the two goddesses, as they become known, that are responsible for permanent fertility on the earth. They give the seasons of grain as well. Taken by Hades as his bride, Persephone is going to be demanded back by her mother Demeter. And then Persephone is going to spend 2/3 of the year on earth when things grow and her mother is happy. The goddess or maiden, in Greek literally kore, or kore, plural, is often shown as a statue of a woman. They are both clothed, of course. Women are not shown nude in art until the late classical era, but we find that it's difficult to distinguish whether or not they are statues of generic women or goddesses, because they are indistinguishable by their name. Hades, in the story, spies Persephone in a meadow and is taken by her. He asks his brother Zeus if he can abduct and marry her. Remember, Zeus is her father. He offers her a flower, then sweeps her away on his chariot to the underworld. In art, we see this moment, this climactic moment where this woman, this young maiden, is abducted by this older, war-hardened man, which would reflect reality in ancient Greece, and taken to his home in the underworld. So she's suffering, of course, death by, of course, going with him. So the struggling can be seen in art as the flailing limbs are going to be the personification of abduction. This is the narrative climax we often see with Bernini's Pluto and Proserpine, where he's stepping over the threshold into Hades, with Cerberus guarding it. She struggles against him, but of course his girth and muscles are no match for her small frame. Distraught by her daughter's absence, she doesn't know where Persephone went. Demeter travels the world asking what happened. And of course, one cannot hide from the sun. So Helios, driving his chariot, saw what happened and Hades abducting Persephone. So Helios informs Demeter of the trickery of the brothers to give her daughter's hand in marriage to this unwanted brother of Zeus. In despair, not knowing what to do, she travels to Eleusis, the site of her cult as it is established just outside of Athens. There she rested at the Well of the Maiden, as it becomes known, and it's named as such because women of the village would fetch water from it. The daughters of Celeus offer her a job, finding her here, very distraught and despondent. She teaches the women their duties in their household when she's brought back. The world, of course, continues to die as Demeter mourns. Zeus sends Iris, the female messenger, to goddesses to deliver messages that relate to women. Iris is going to beckon her to return the fertility to the earth, but she refuses and will not be moved, still mourning for the loss of her daughter. They then send Hermes to persuade Hades to let Persephone go. Hades agrees to give her up, but gives her pomegranate seeds to eat before she leaves. In the story, she willingly takes this flower or seeds from the pomegranate and eats them, but later claims it is a deception on Hades' part because she now must return to the underworld for the amount and number of pomegranate seeds that she eats. The problem with this myth as an agricultural allegory explaining the seasons is that wheat does not grow in the springtime in ancient Greece. So, what else could the story be talking about? Well, this is going to reflect the experience of many Greek girls and their mothers who are married off at age 14 to war-hardened men that are twice their age. In this sense, they are ripe to be plucked, as we often hear the story that they are gathering flowers in a meadow. Thus, of course, they are giving us the term to deflower in this way. The loss of virginity, as follows marriage, is equal to the death of childhood. They are no longer girls. They are now, of course, married women. Now, this is the end of playing with friends and a lack of responsibility. Now, all the responsibility associated with womanhood rests on her shoulders. Brides, as it were, tying to this tradition, would carry an apple into the bridal chambers as part of the first night of consorting. We find the pomegranate seed is what is tied here to the myth of Persephone. Now, the father had the right to give his daughter to whomever he chose. The mother did not have a say in it in many cases. In this case, Zeus gives Persephone to Hades as his daughter. Now, they are often kept within the family and to ensure that property would be still there within the family in this intermarriage. So we find this does happen in ancient Greek civilization where you would marry off to one's cousin or a relative so that should something happen to either one of them, the property or what they owned would remain in the family. We also must remember that marriage is equivalent to literal death in ancient Greece because so many women died in childbirth. We see this in myth repeatedly. So therefore, not only is marriage the end of childhood, but in the product of or the production of children, she also has a high mortality rate. Now, a Greek girl that died who was unmarried was referred to as Hades' bride. The wedding vase was often placed over her grave because now she is married finally to the god of the dead. Now, pomegranate seeds are going to be symbolic of sexual union in the Mediterranean, and we see them in many erotic contexts. So we find that her acceptance of this gift of a pomegranate seed relates to her sexual curiosity in this culture that brings about the division between herself and her mother as she becomes a bride as part of this process. As the Greeks understood it, life depends on death. And this is the experience of mothers. They must mourn the death of their daughter, whether they, of course, just left the household and they will not see them, or if they literally died as a result of childbirth. They must mourn them and move on. Therefore, Demeter, in her mourning, is going to be the model for the Virgin Mary and the Mater Dolorosa, which is the grieving mother that we see so often in these paintings of Christian themes later on, of her lamenting the death of her son after the crucifixion. Obviously, Demeter is a very important goddess as she relates to this notion of death and rebirth. Therefore, it's not surprising that the Eleusinian Mysteries would sprout from her tradition. Now, this is a religious cult that Athens absorbs as they conquer Eleusis, which is right next to them. By the 7th century, they, of course, control this area where this cult practices. Now, the notion of mystery in ancient Greece is important, for it literally means one who closes, as in one who closes their eyes to enter a temple as you're about to receive special information, and of course, very potent information that can lead to everlasting life. Now, in Latin, this initiatus, or initiate, is one who has gone into the temple of Demeter. So a very important cult that gives us these terms moving forward. Initiates would be killed if they ever divulged what actually happened in these rituals. Well, there is no doctrine in ancient Greece to anything that we will discuss. There is no official word or Bible or verse that actually states what one should and should not do. Instead, they're going to practice magical rites and incantations. So knowing these specific magical rites are what brings one into the cult, and you cannot share it. Therefore, it is a secret. Triptolemus, a prince of Eleusis, is going to learn from Demeter the secrets of these rites. He then rides his dragon chariot all over the world, teaching everyone how to grow grain. So a very important part of the spread of the fertility of the land. Cybele is another fertility goddess from the east that factors largely in the myths associated with Demeter and helps us understand what fertility actually took in the ancient world, what the gods and goddesses demanded of us in order to allow us to grow food, in order to make the land fertile. So this Phrygian goddess Cybele and a youthful lover Attis are the model for the Greek's word for sibyl or prophetesses, these that tell or foretell the future. As the story goes, Zeus ejaculates on a rock trying to impregnate Cybele. The rock then bears a son, Agdestus. Now this is a beast of violent strength that Dionysus must make drunk and binds up with vines. When he awakes from his drunken stupor, he rips his genitals off, not seeing the vines bound around them. The blood falling from his severed genitals is going to create a pomegranate tree. And if you remember, pomegranates are associated with sexual union. Nana is then going to pick up the pomegranate and becoming pregnant immediately. She gives birth to Attis. Attis is driven mad at a wedding and rips off his own genitals, just as we saw Agdestus had. So the point here is that self-castration is seen as necessary in some cultures to appease divine powers, to make the earth fertile. In other words, blood is life, and you must spill it just like semen in order to create new life. As it relates to the Eleusinian Mysteries, we find that in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Venus is scratched by Cupid's arrow and falls madly in love with a hunter Adonis. Now she knows that he will be killed by a boar on a hunt, but refuses to listen to her as she tells him, and he dies anyway. So he cared only for the hunt, this Adonis, and of course he was warned against big game by the goddess Venus. The boar, of course, gouges his thigh, severing his femoral artery, and he bleeds to death. But from his wound sprouts and is the etiological explanation for where blood red anemones come from. These beautiful flowers come from the death of Adonis. Now, the cult of Adonis, the women that follow this cult and practice in it, would plant seeds shallowly, allowing them to die, and thus tearing their hair and lamenting the death of Adonis as such, this beautiful man who Venus loved, who she could not save. Turning now to the male counterpart of fertility in nature, Dionysus, the god of wine, we find that the Dionysic Mysteries are also going to be a very important and a very popular practice among women in the ancient Greek world. Now, Dionysus is going to be the god of wine, and he is going to be one of the youngest of the Olympians here, and the only one born to a mortal woman. He represents the instinctive side of personality. His thick ivy is the sign of his presence that's going to grow around grapes. His leopard skin and panthers pulled by a chariot tell us that he is not a Western or Grecian god. He comes from the East and is associated with ferocious wild animals. Thus, he is not representative of civilization or reason and rationality. As the male principle of fertility and the counterpart to Demeter, it's not surprising that his symbols will be that of a phallus and the horns of a bull. And of course, the horns of a bull represent the phallic symbols in themselves. Now, the Dionysian cult is going to be defined by divinely inspired madness in order to ensure fertility. The story of his own conception is also very important. Semele, his mother, is a princess of Thebes and is tricked by Zeus as a mortal man coming to her not as a god. He tells her after they consort and she becomes pregnant that he is in fact the king of the gods. Hera becomes wildly jealous and disguises herself as an old woman coming to Semele and tells her that Zeus has lied to her, that in fact he is not the king of the gods and she should test him. Semele begins to doubt and, as Hera had suggested, asks for one wish from him that he grants. She then asks, "Appear to me as you appear to Hera when you make love to her." He, of course, laments but promised to honor this wish. So he shows his divine form and she is burned alive. But Hermes saves the 6-month-old fetus, which is Dionysus, from death because he is half god. In art, once again, we see this divine presence of Jupiter and what it does to someone who witnesses it as a mortal. So you find that she's already bleeding. As in the Christian tradition, the union with God calls for death. We cannot see God until we die. Hence, this is quite common. Now, Zeus is going to sew into his thigh this fetus, and 3 months later, we now know Dionysus as the twice-born god. Here you see him coming out of Zeus's thigh, and he is then going to begin his long travels, being tormented by Hera. Hermes takes this infant to Ino, the queen of Ormechnus, to protect him because Hera wishes to harm him. So they disguise him in girl's clothes, but Hera still discovers him in the household and drives Ino and Athamassus insane. Athamassus is going to shoot one of his sons, mistaking him for a fawn, while Ino is boiled with the other son alive in a pot. She runs to the Gulf of Corinth, being horrified after killing her own child, and leaps into the sea. Her name then changes to Leucothea, the white goddess. Zeus then transforms Dionysus into a goat, much like he had Io into a cow earlier to hide him from the jealous wife of Zeus. Hermes delivers this goat to the nymphs of Nysa, where he is going to, that is, Dionysus is going to discover wine. Hera finds him again and strikes these nymphs with madness. So you find that Dionysus now is forced to wander to Asia Minor to Cybele, whose followers danced in orgiastic rituals. They cure him of his form of a goat and transforms him back into his godlike form. From Cybele, Dionysus is going to acquire the effeminate robes he will wear. He also is going to be over an effeminate cult. Only women belong to his cult, so it's appropriate he would dress like a woman. The female followers of Dionysus in Latin are called Bacchae, or women who are possessed by Bacchus. Theades in Greek refers to their name as the frenzied ones, and Maenads, another word for them, are the raging women, who would of course get drunk and eat raw meat of wild animals they tear apart. The male followers of Dionysus are not humans. They once again are satyrs and Silenus, the son of Pan. Like Cybele, we find he will travel by chariot drawn by panthers or cheetahs in art, as it is shown. Here we find the Bacchanal we'll discuss in a moment, but we often see Bacchus being driven around by these wild feral animals. So sometimes they look like tigers, other times cheetahs, but they definitely are not mountain lions or cougars as you would have in Italy. Here we find the drunken Silenus is going to be at many of these Bacchanals accompanying Dionysus, as they are going to spread this type of fertility. Now, as Dionysus returns to the west, he comes to King Midas, the son of Cybele, and because Cybele had helped him, he grants this king a wish. King Midas famously wishes that everything he touches be turned to gold. However, he does not think this through, for everything he touches turns to gold, including his food and drink, so he cannot sustain himself. He is told by Dionysus to go bathe in the Pactolus River, which carries the gold away to Lydia. This is the etymological explanation as to why the Lydians invent coins in the 6th century, is because of the golden touch of Midas. Now, Dionysus will marry Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who is, of course, going to be the son of Zeus and Europa. He finds her abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos after slaying the Minotaur. So you find that he then marries her, transforming her into a constellation. This is referred to as a bacchanal, and the wedding between Bacchus and Ariadne is a primary subject of any bacchanalia, where we find that Dionysus and his followers, these satyrs, Silenus, and other women, are going to be shown ripping apart raw meat and celebrating this union, which of course leads to fertility. In art, we often see the same subjects and the same characters that are carrying on celebrating this union of the two. As we find Dionysus finally returns to the west, he encounters repeated resistance, and this is significant. King Pentheus tries to arrest him. Thus Agave, Ino, and Atone dismember him, ripping him apart. Etruscan pirates are going to throw themselves into the sea in madness as they did not recognize him as a god. Here we find him. So Dionysus coming back is going to tell them that he is a god and to accept him, and they refuse. Thus they must die. We find that he punishes his mother Semele's 3 sisters, who denied Semele's claim that she had slept with Zeus by driving them mad as well. So well as Hera drives people into madness trying to punish Dionysus as a child, once he has grown older, he himself inflicts this madness upon others. He travels throughout the known world to Egypt and India, and this is the explanation for the Greeks as to how vine growing and wine production spreads throughout the known world. Before heading to Olympus, he is going to take his mother out of death's grip itself in Hades. Remember, she burned alive, seeing Zeus's true form. So he stops and asks a shepherd from Argos where the entrance to the underworld actually is in the Alcanian lake. In these depths, he emerges in the lower world and pleads with Hades to release his mother. She then is taken to Olympus and changing her name to Thyone. The shepherd, when he comes back, he wishes to thank him for helping find Hades. He discovers the shepherd has already died. Dionysus then carves a phallus from a fig branch and leaves it on his grave. So what does all of this mean? Well, repeatedly we have this foreign god that drives people mad as they resist him, just as the Greeks resisted accepting this foreign Olympian into their pantheon because they value rationalism. He, however, represents the exact opposite. He represents intuition and femininity and the other, according to the Greeks. In religion, Dionysus represents the god of fertility and the power over fruitfulness and moisture in plants, the wet component of things, of all natural things that create life, like semen, sap, milk, and blood. His cult is going to reflect and practice much of what we see in myth. Enthusiasmos, for instance, is a term used by those practicing in the cult of Dionysus, meaning being filled with the god. Thus we get the word enthusiasm that one would have. Ecstasis is going to be standing outside of oneself during this practice as you're in a drunken orgiastic ritual. Thus is where we get the term ecstasy. So the continuous dancing that his followers would conduct to flutes and drums, accompanied by the consumption of wine and the communal tearing apart of wild animals and eating their raw flesh, is part of this Eastern, very irrational practice that was alien to the Greeks. So cannibalism is also seen as part of the eating of raw flesh in the myth. So whereas they would tear apart animals in the actual practice, in myth we see this with Pentheus and Ino boiling their son, whereas Minyaids are going to eat their own children. Therefore, the Dionysic rituals are the model that Christians are going to have later on for the witches' Black Sabbath, where drunken orgiastic celebration leads an infanticide, the opposite of fertility, where you have a goat, which of course is going to follow Dionysus around as well, with satyrs, with women following him out in the wilderness. So therefore, we have all of the components of a Black Sabbath in this Dionysic rituals. In art, we find that witches are without men overseeing them, often accompanied by goat-like creatures. Thus, this is where the idea came from in eating raw meat and destroying life. Now, in these stories, we find there are several folktale types, such as the short-sighted wish, with Midas asking to turn anything to gold he touches, or the vengeful stepmother with Hera trying to punish Dionysus. As the protectress of marriage, Hera is always opposed to the god, especially Dionysus, because he excited married women to madness and causing them to forget their duty to family. Now, surrounded by women and having female followers, we have many cults to Dionysus and their secret meeting places, such as the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. Within, we get an insight into the initiation rites and rituals of this god, as women are going to be whipped as part of this, while gods and other humans look on. So the actions that we're looking at here is going to be the initiate or bride-to-be of Dionysus being whipped and prepared for what is going to happen as they get this special knowledge relating to fertility. In fact, Dionysus is also tied to theater as well. We find the very first theatrical productions and buildings, the structures themselves are dedicated to him. The word itself, theatron, is the area overlooking where the dancing takes place, or the orchestra, right, your place for seeing. Here, this is the precursor to these rites and dances and songs. We see this happening here as a religious act, later as entertainment for the Greeks. For women would dance to entertain the god Dionysus. Down here, as you would have an altar to him where you would sacrifice. As the actors would wear masks, they would project their voices up through this audience, as they're going to be sitting in a radiating half circle, listening to the chants and the songs that praise this god of fertility. Dionysus and Pan, as we discussed earlier, are models for devils in Christian tradition. But what is interesting is Christians are going to use the identification of this god and his worshippers in their own doctrine, the Eucharistic tradition, which is where in communion or in Mass, Christians are going to drink wine and eat bread in commemoration of the sacrifice of Christ. Therefore, we have this consuming of blood and flesh still bound up in the Christian tradition. In fact, Dionysian sarcophagi are reused for Christian burials, not surprisingly representing the Christus Patiens, or the suffering Christ. In fact, on these, the notion of Pentheus interrogating Dionysus is the same as Pontius Pilate interrogating Christ. So we find that Christians leave a lot of the iconography alone with Dionysus because of the importance wine plays in the Christian tradition, especially with the Eucharist. Now, in the next class, we will cover the myths of death and turn our attention to the opposite of fertility in the underworld.